There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over the hill country of western Pennsylvania in the weeks before the first frost. It is not the stillness of emptiness. It is the stillness of things holding their breath. The trees stand full and heavy with the last of their leaves, copper and amber, and the deep red of old brick. And the fields between the farms stretch out in the pale morning light like something arranged by a careful hand. Smoke rises from chimneys in thin, patient columns. Dogs sleep on porch steps. The roads are soft with mud from the autumn rains, and the marks left by wagon wheels fill slowly with water that mirrors the grey sky above. In October of 1908, Harlow County was the kind of place that people from the city imagined when they wanted to believe the world was still simple. 36 farms spread across the hills north of the town of Graymill, connected by dirt roads that wound through stands of oak and pine, crossed shallow creeks on wooden bridges that creaked in the wind, and eventually dissolved into footpaths that only the local people knew how to follow. The nearest telegraph office was 11 miles south. The nearest hospital was in Pittsburgh, which most residents had never visited and did not intend to. It was in this setting, on the morning of October the 3rd, that Anna Fielding brought fresh bread to her neighbour Margaret Cross, as she had done every Thursday for 7 years. She walked the half-mile between their properties with the loaf wrapped in a clean cloth, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her boots leaving careful prints in the frost-stiffened grass along the path. The sky was the colour of pewter. A crow called once from somewhere in the pines, and then went silent. Margaret's door was open, not simply unlocked, open. Standing wide against the morning cold, the wooden frame swinging gently on its hinges, as if someone had passed through it moments before. The fire inside had gone out. The breakfast things were set on the table, 2 plates, 2 cups, and a pot of cold coffee, as though Margaret had been expecting company. The bread she had baked the day before sat on the sideboard, untouched. Her coat was hanging on its hook by the door. Her shoes were placed neatly beneath the bed, side by side, as they always were each night. Margaret Cross was 41 years old. She had lived alone on that property since her husband drowned in the Harlow Creek the spring of 1903. She had no children. She kept 6 chickens and a small kitchen garden, and occasionally took in mending work for families in the valley. She was not the kind of woman who left her door open in cold weather. She was not the kind of woman who left her shoes behind if she intended to go somewhere. Anna Fielding stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding her bread, feeling a sensation she would later describe to Sheriff James Collins as something between cold water and electricity moving through her chest. Then she set the loaf on the table beside the untouched breakfast, turned around, and walked the 11 minutes to the sheriff's office in Graymill, without running, though she wanted to. James Collins had been the sheriff of Harlow County for 9 years. He was a quiet man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that people found easy to trust, not because it was handsome in any particular way, but because it was steady. His expressions changed slowly and with purpose. He listened before he spoke. He had a habit of sitting very still when someone was talking to him, his hands folded on the desk in front of him, his eyes level. And this stillness made people feel that what they were saying was being received completely, turned over carefully, given its full weight. He listened to Anna Fielding in exactly this way. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and went to see Margaret Cross's house for himself. He noted everything Anna described: the open door, the cold fire, the set table, the coat on its hook, the shoes beneath the bed. He walked the perimeter of the property twice, reading the ground with the practiced attention of a man who had spent years learning what mud and grass and disturbed earth could say. He found no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away through the fields that he could follow to a clear conclusion. There were marks in the soft ground near the back of the house that might have been a second set of footprints, but the frost and the overnight rain had softened their edges until they said nothing definite. Collins stood at the edge of Margaret's property and looked out at the tree line 200 yards to the north. The pines stood in their rows, dark and close, their shadows falling toward him in the early light. He went back to his office and wrote up a report. Missing person. No signs of violence. He sent word to the families on the neighbouring farms and asked if anyone had seen Margaret Cross in the past 24 hours. No one had. He organised a search party for the following morning. He did all of this methodically, professionally, with the calm efficiency of a man who dealt in facts and intended to find them. But that evening, sitting alone in his office after the lamp oil in the courthouse had been turned down and the building had gone quiet around him, Collins found himself returning again and again to the image of those shoes beneath the bed, placed neatly, side by side, as if someone had set them there with deliberate, careful hands. Not the way a person set their shoes down when they were tired, or rushing, or distracted. The way a person set something down when they intended it to be found exactly like that. Arranged. He sat with that thought for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the hill behind the town, and the sound it made was low and continuous, like something breathing. The search for Margaret Cross found nothing. Collins led the party himself. 23 men spread across the hills in a line, working methodically through the woods and fields, north and east of her property. They called her name until the sound of it became strange and hollow in the cold air. They checked the creek banks, the old mill pond, the collapsed barn at the edge of the Garner property that had been abandoned since 1899. They found no trace of her. On the fourth day of the search, Collins received a visit from Thomas Wren, who farmed a 40-acre parcel 2 miles northeast of Greymill. Wren was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who spoke carefully and wasted no words. He sat across from Collins's desk and said that he thought the sheriff should know that his wife's younger sister, Emilia, had also not come home. Emilia Sayers was 29 years old. She lived alone in a rented cottage on the edge of the Wren property, doing alterations and fine needlework for families across the county. She had last been seen 4 days ago, which Collins noted with a particular stillness in his expression, was the same day Margaret Cross disappeared. Wren said he had not come forward immediately because he assumed Emilia had gone to visit a friend in the next county and simply had not sent word, which was unlike her, but not impossible. It was his wife who had finally insisted he speak to Collins. She said something felt wrong in a way she could not explain. She said the feeling had been in her chest since the morning of the 1st. Collins asked Wren if Emilia had seemed different in the weeks before her disappearance, changed in her manner or habits. Wren thought about this for a while, the way he thought about everything, slowly and with a farmer's patience. He said that she had seemed, if anything, lighter. That was the word he used. Lighter. As if something she had been carrying had been lifted from her. She had been smiling more. She had seemed calm in a way that was pleasant, but that his wife had found, in retrospect, slightly unfamiliar. As if Emilia had resolved something within herself, or had been persuaded that something she had worried about was no longer worth worrying about. Collins wrote this down. He underlined the word lighter without fully understanding why. That same afternoon, he received a third piece of information. Clara Bennett, 30 years old, a seamstress who lived on the south side of Greymill, had told her landlady on the morning of October 1st that she was going to deliver a finished dress to a client on the Marsh Road and would be back before dark. She had not returned. Her landlady, a practical woman named Mrs. Hoyle, had assumed that Clara had stayed the night at the client's house and would appear the next day. When she did not, Mrs. Hoyle had asked around and discovered that the client on Marsh Road had received no visit from Clara and had not been expecting one. 3 women, 11 days, an area of roughly 6 square miles. No bodies, no struggle, no clear motive, no obvious connection between the victims beyond the fact that all 3 lived either alone or in situations where their daily movements were not closely monitored. Collins spread a hand-drawn map of the county across his desk that evening and marked the 3 properties with small crosses. He studied the geography for a long time, the way the roads connected them, the way the woodlands ran between them, the topography of the hills to the north. There was no single obvious path linking all 3 locations, but there was a general direction of convergence, a region in the northern hills where the oldest and densest part of the pine forest covered a series of ridges that few people had reason to visit. He was still studying the map when the door to his office opened and a woman came in out of the dark. Her name was Amelia Harper, though Collins would learn this only in a moment. She was 27 years old, slight, with dark hair pinned back from a face that was sharp-boned and watchful. She moved quietly, with the particular economy of someone accustomed to navigating the world without drawing attention to herself. She sat down across from his desk without being invited, and looked at the map he had spread there, and said that she thought she knew something useful, but that she needed him to listen carefully before he decided what to do with it. Collins folded his hands and listened. Amelia was a herbalist. She knew the hills north of Greymill better than almost anyone because she had spent years working them for medicinal plants, learning which slopes held the right conditions for yarrow and elderberry, and the particular ferns that grew only in the shallow ravines where the limestone showed through the hillside. She knew every footpath, every old logging track, every place where the ground showed signs of use that did not belong to hunters or farmers. She said that about 3 months ago, she had noticed someone she did not recognize in those hills. A man. She described him as tall, lean, somewhere between 50 and 60 years old, with light grey eyes and a deliberate, unhurried way of moving through the landscape that suggested he knew it well. She had seen him twice from a distance and once close enough to exchange a nod of acknowledgement on a narrow path. He had not spoken to her on that occasion. He had simply stepped aside to let her pass and watched her go, with an expression she found difficult to characterize. Not threatening, not friendly, attentive, as if he were reading something in her face that she did not know was written there. She had asked around and learned that the man was known in the northern part of the county as Mr. Gray. No first name, no known surname beyond that. He had appeared in the region sometime in the late summer, renting a room from a widow named Paulson on the Ridgeline Road. He was described as educated, quiet, and helpful in a particular way that several people mentioned independently of each other. He seemed to know what a person needed before they said it. He offered assistance with a naturalness that made it feel less like charity and more like simple attention to the world. He had helped 3 different families with repairs and heavy work over the course of the summer. He had brought medicine to an elderly farmer whose nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. He had, on at least 2 occasions, spent an evening in conversation with women from the northern farms, and those women had mentioned him afterward with a warmth that Amelia found, in her words, slightly too uniform. Collins asked her what she meant by that. She paused. She was not the kind of person who spoke before she had settled on the right words. She said that when people talked about someone who had genuinely helped them, there was usually something particular in what they said, something specific to that person's experience, some detail that was their own. But when the women she spoke to talked about Mr. Gray, they sounded similar, in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like they were describing the same internal weather. A feeling of clarity, a sense of relief, a reduction in anxiety that they could not precisely trace to anything he had said or done. Collins was quiet for a moment. Then he asked whether Amelia had encountered Gray in any capacity beyond those brief sightings on the hill paths. She said yes. Once. About 6 weeks before Margaret Cross disappeared. She had been working a slope in the northern hills when the weather turned quickly, as it does in autumn, and she had taken shelter under an old stone outcropping to wait out a short but heavy rain. Gray had arrived at the same outcropping a few minutes later, apparently also caught by the weather. They had stood together in that small, dry space for perhaps 20 minutes while the rain came down through the pines, and he had talked to her. Collins asked what he had talked about. Amelia was quiet for slightly longer than felt natural. Then she said he had talked about loneliness. About the particular loneliness of people who perceived the world more finely than others. About how that perception was a form of intelligence that conventional society had never found a use for. She said his words had been precise and careful, and had felt, while he was saying them, as if they had been constructed specifically for her, drawn from observations he had made about her in particular, rather than offered as general philosophy. She had felt, standing there in the rain, a sensation she described as unspooling, as if a tension she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there, was quietly being removed from her. She had gone home afterward and slept for 11 hours. Collins spent the following week building a picture of Mr. Gray the way he built every investigation, piece by piece, never assuming the shape of the thing before he had enough pieces to see it clearly. He spoke to the widow Paulson, who said Gray was a courteous tenant who kept his room orderly and paid on time and asked for nothing. He spoke to the families Gray had helped with repairs. He spoke to 4 separate women who had had extended conversations with Gray over the course of the summer. Each of those women was cooperative and pleasant. Each of them spoke about Gray with the same quality of warmth that Amelia had described. Measured, consistent, and somehow slightly depersonalized, as if they were recalling a feeling more than a person. Collins noticed that when he pressed for specific details, specific things Gray had said or done, the women became slightly vague. Not evasive exactly, but imprecise, as though the memories had been stored in a form that resisted retrieval. He also noticed that each of these women had, in the weeks since their encounters with Gray, undergone a subtle shift that the people closest to them had registered. A reduction in the ordinary small anxieties of daily life. A quality of calm that their husbands, siblings, or friends described variously as peace, contentment, or, in one case, distance. As if something that had connected them to the texture of their own lives had been gently loosened. Collins was a rational man. He believed in causes and their effects, in evidence and what it demonstrated. He did not believe in supernatural explanations, and he did not intend to start. But he found himself, in the private hours of his investigation, sitting with a discomfort he could not entirely resolve through logic. He went to speak with Gray directly on a Thursday afternoon. He had no arrest warrant and no grounds for one, He went as a sheriff, conducting routine inquiries, which was true, and also as a man who wanted to observe. The widow Paulson's house was a solid 2-story farmhouse set back from the Ridgeline Road behind a row of old maples. Gray was sitting on the porch when Collins arrived, reading a book whose title Collins noted but did not immediately recognize. Something about consciousness and the boundaries of the self. He set the book down when Collins approached and looked at him with the light grey eyes that Amelia had described. And the first thing Collins thought, before he could formulate any professional or analytical response, was that the man was paying very close attention. Not to his uniform, or his badge, or the official purpose of his visit. To him. To Collins himself, in a way that felt like being measured from the inside. They spoke for 40 minutes. Gray was cooperative and forthcoming. He acknowledged knowing Margaret Cross and Clara Bennett, said he had helped both women with minor repairs on their properties over the summer. He expressed appropriate concern about their disappearances, asked if there was anything he could do to assist the investigation. His voice was low and unhurried, and each sentence was constructed with a precision that Collins found professionally admirable and personally unsettling. Collins asked him about his background, his history in the county, his reasons for settling in the area. Gray answered each question completely and without hesitation. He said he had spent much of his adult life in study, moving between regions, following interests that did not conform easily to the standard categories of academic or professional life. He spoke of psychology, of philosophy, of what he called the architecture of belief, the structures within people that determined not just what they thought, but what they were capable of perceiving. He said it with the ease of a man discussing weather or crops, as if it were ordinary conversation, and Collins found that with each passing minute, it was taking slightly more effort to remember the precise reason he had come. He made himself stand up before 40 minutes were finished. He thanked Gray, said he might have further questions, and walked back to his horse at the road. He did not look back at the porch. Riding back to Greymill, Collins became aware of something he found difficult to name. A quality of stillness in his own mind that had not been there before. A reduction in the particular low-level restlessness that he carried always. The unresolved cases, the obligations, the things left undone. It was not an unpleasant sensation. That was what troubled him about it. It was pleasant in a way that had no clear source, like warmth from a fire you have not lit. He stopped his horse on the Ridgeline Road and sat there in the cold afternoon light for a long moment, actively thinking about Margaret Cross's shoes placed neatly beneath her bed, using the image deliberately as a counterweight to something he felt but could not identify. Then he continued back to town. It was Amelia Harper who finally gave Collins the piece he needed, and she did it not by offering new information, but by remembering something she had not, until that moment, understood the significance of. She came to his office on a Monday morning, 12 days after her first visit. She looked tired, in a way that suggested she had not been sleeping well, and she sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, and said that she had been thinking about the afternoon under the stone outcropping, the conversation with Gray, the feeling she had described as unspooling. She said she had been picking apart that conversation since she had last spoken with Collins, and had recovered something she had not initially mentioned, either because she had not thought it relevant, or because, she said, with a particular careful flatness in her voice, she suspected she had not been meant to think about it at all. Near the end of their time under the outcropping, as the rain was letting off and she was preparing to continue down the hillside, Gray had said something almost incidentally, in the tone of a man making an observation rather than a suggestion. He had described a place in the northern hills, a particular configuration of rock and old-growth forest above a ridge that he said was unlike anything else in the region. A place where the quality of the air and the light and the sound created an experience that was, in his words, incomparable. He had not invited her to go there. He had simply described it in passing, the way a man might mention a book worth reading, and she had thought nothing of it at the time. But she had looked for that place afterward. She had found it without difficulty, as if the description had been placed in her memory not as general information, but as a set of directions. And she had gone there twice, alone, without mentioning it to anyone, and both times had experienced a quality of peace that she now, sitting in Collins's office, found she could not account for in any terms that satisfied her. She said the place was a natural rock formation above the North Ridge, surrounding the entrance to a cave system that she had not explored, but that clearly ran deep into the hillside. There were marks on the rocks near the entrance, carved symbols, or something that functioned like symbols, and around the entrance, arranged with a deliberateness that she had noticed but not, at the time, found alarming, were small personal objects. A button, a length of ribbon, a folded piece of paper that she had not opened. Collins organized an expedition to the northern hills the following morning. He brought 4 men and enough rope and lanterns to explore a significant underground passage. Emilia Harper came with them as a guide, though Collins had reservations about bringing her back to a place that had already exercised some pull on her attention. They reached the rock formation in the early afternoon. The carved marks were there, as she had described, and Collins recognized in them something organized and intentional, a system of notation whose meaning he could not read, but whose deliberateness was unmistakable. The objects around the entrance had been added to since Emilia's last visit. There were now what Collins estimated to be a dozen items, small personal articles of the kind a woman might carry: a thimble, a hair comb, a brass button from a coat. He recognized the button. It had come from the coat that Clara Bennett was wearing on the morning she disappeared, according to the description her landlady had provided. They entered the cave. The passage ran deep into the hillside, descending gradually over the first 100 yards, and then more steeply through a system of natural chambers connected by narrow corridors that required the men to turn sideways in places. Collins led, holding his lantern ahead of him, reading the ground for signs of recent use. There were footprints in the damp clay of the cave floor, multiple sets, some overlapping, suggesting this passage had been travelled repeatedly over an extended period. They descended for what Collins estimated was close to a quarter mile before the passage opened into a large, natural chamber where they stopped. In the chamber, arranged against the far wall, were 3 women. They were not bound. They were not, at first appearance, injured. Margaret Cross and Clara Bennett sat together on a ledge of flat stone, and between them sat a third woman, whom Collins did not immediately recognize. All 3 were awake and aware of his presence. All 3 looked at him and his men with expressions that he would spend a long time afterward trying to accurately describe. Not fear, not relief. Something closer to the gentle confusion of people who have been asleep and are not entirely certain they want to be awake. Collins crossed the chamber and crouched down in front of Margaret Cross and said her name. She looked at him with full recognition. She said his name back. Her voice was steady and her eyes were clear, but there was a quality in her manner, a kind of settled distance, as if the urgency that ought to have inhabited this moment was present only at the surface, while something deeper remained undisturbed. He asked if she was all right. She said yes, she believed she was. He asked if she had been hurt. She said no. He asked if she had come here willingly. She paused for only a moment, and then said, yes. She had come because she wanted to understand something, and she thought she was beginning to understand it. Collins asked her what she meant by that. She said that it was difficult to explain to someone who had not experienced it. She said that in this place, in the dark and the quiet, certain things became very clear. Certain things that had troubled her for years had ceased to trouble her. She seemed to want to say more, but the words moved slowly, as if she were translating from a language that did not map cleanly onto English. Clara Bennett said nothing, but watched Collins with a calm, assessing attention that reminded him, with a physical jolt, of the way Gray had looked at him on the widow Paulson's porch. He got all three women out of the cave. He did not rush them because they were not panicking, and in the absence of panic, he found himself moving at a pace that matched their own unhurried cooperation. This bothered him later. At the time, it felt natural. Gray was gone from the widow Paulson's house. His room had been left in the same condition as everything else connected to this case. Orderly, deliberate, suggesting a departure that was planned rather than panicked. His books were gone. His papers were gone. The only thing remaining in his room was a single notebook, left on the bare mattress, in a position that Collins could only interpret as intentional, placed where it would be found by whoever came looking. Collins read the notebook over 2 evenings. The writing was dense and precise, in a hand that was small but very clear, the hand of a man accustomed to recording thoughts that mattered to him. Gray was not, or had not always been, his name. The early pages of the notebook suggested a history in academic institutions, years of study in philosophy, and in what he called empirical psychology, a term he used in a sense that did not align with anything Collins had encountered in conventional medical reading. He had developed, over decades, a theory about what he termed consensual dissolution. The idea that the boundaries of individual consciousness were not fixed structures, but learned behaviors, habitual patterns of attention and resistance that could, under the right conditions, be gently and permanently relaxed. He described techniques he had refined over years, long conversations conducted with specific psychological precision, conversations designed not to persuade, but to locate the particular tensions within a person's sense of self and apply, with the subtlety of a careful hand, exactly the right pressure in exactly the right direction. He described this work with the clinical satisfaction of a craftsman who has spent years perfecting a method. And he described his subjects, always women, always isolated in ways that left them carrying the particular weight that isolation accumulates, with a concern that Collins could not classify as either genuine or simulated. It seemed to be both. The cave, Gray wrote, was not incidental. He believed certain geological spaces had properties that made his work more efficient. Something about the combination of enclosure, silence, and the specific quality of underground air that reduced the brain's habitual defensive processing and made people more permeable to suggestion and internal change. He had discovered the Harlow County system through years of searching and considered it unusually well suited to his purposes. The notebook described, in terms that were philosophical and abstract, but whose practical implications were unmistakable, more than 30 women across 4 counties over the course of 15 years. In each case, he had spent weeks or months in preparation before a woman agreed, of her own apparent volition, to accompany him to what he described as a place of particular significance. In each case, the agreement was genuine by every external measure. No force was used, no threats were made. The women came freely, or believed they did. And that distinction, Collins understood as he read, was precisely the point. Most of Gray's previous subjects had eventually returned to their lives. This was documented in the notebook with the same calm precision as everything else. They returned changed in ways that their communities noticed but could not precisely name. Quieter, less restless, less dissatisfied, less themselves, in ways that were difficult to articulate because less than yourself has no natural language. Some of the changes faded over months or years. Others persisted. Gray recorded all of this without judgment, only observation. Collins put the notebook down on his second evening of reading and sat in his office for a long time without doing anything at all. Then he wrote up his official report. Missing persons recovered. No evidence of criminal coercion. Investigation ongoing. He did not include the notebook's contents in the official report. He kept the notebook in the same locked drawer where he put the things he needed to keep, but did not want to look at often. Margaret Cross returned to her property and resumed her life. Her chickens were fed by a neighbour during her absence. Her fire was relaid. Her bread, naturally, was stale, and she threw it out and baked new bread, and the smoke rose from her chimney in the same thin, patient column as always. People who visited her in the weeks following remarked that she seemed well. Some of them used the word peaceful. Clara Bennett returned to her sewing work. Her manner was somewhat quieter than before, but her hands were steady and her work was as fine as it had ever been. Her landlady, Mrs. Hoyle, said that Clara seemed older, not in appearance, but in the quality of her attention, as if she were observing the world from a slightly greater distance than previously. The third woman from the cave, whom Collins eventually identified as a widow named Ruth Carey, from a farm on the county's far northern edge, who had not yet been reported missing, returned home and said little about her experience to anyone. 3 weeks after her return, she sold her farm and moved away. Collins never received any forwarding information. Emilia Harper remained in Harlow County. She came to speak with Collins twice in the weeks following the recovery, not to report anything new, but, it seemed to Collins, to anchor herself in conversation with someone who knew what had happened, who shared the knowledge of it. She had not been inside the cave. She had been the one to lead them there, and that role had kept her at the threshold. But she carried the knowledge of the place in a way Collins recognized, because he carried it too. He asked her once, directly, what she thought had been done to the women Gray worked with. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she thought the word done was part of the problem. She said she thought what Gray had developed was a way of meeting people in their loneliness so precisely and completely that the loneliness itself became a kind of door, and what Gray did was open it, not to force anyone through, but to make the threshold so comfortable, so right-feeling, that stepping through it felt like the most natural thing in the world. And once through, she said, you were still yourself, entirely yourself. But certain things that had made the world feel sharp and difficult and real had been quietly removed, like removing stones from a path, except that the stones were part of what had made you yours. Collins had no useful response to this. He sat with it in his characteristic stillness. Gray was never found. Collins filed reports with the county and with the state authorities, and included enough detail to make the case actionable, but not enough, he told himself, to cause unnecessary alarm about something that could not be fully explained within the available legal language. He monitored the northern hills through the following year. He spoke to the families of women across the 4 counties mentioned in the notebook. He found, in almost every case, what he had found with Margaret and Clara and Ruth. Women who had been somewhere they could not entirely describe, who had returned different in ways they could not entirely articulate, and who said, when pressed, that they had gone of their own free will and would not say otherwise. In the spring of 1910, Collins received a letter from a sheriff in a county in Ohio, asking whether Collins had any information on a man matching Gray's description who had been seen in the area and who had been mentioned by name, Mr. Gray, in connection with the disappearance of 2 women from a farming community outside of Dayton. Collins wrote back with what he knew, which was detailed and carefully assembled, and the Ohio sheriff thanked him and said he would follow up. He did not hear from the Ohio sheriff again. What troubled Collins most in the years that followed was not the mystery of Gray's methods or his whereabouts. It was not even the question of the women, most of whom had, in every observable sense, resumed their lives. What troubled him was something Amelia Harper had said during one of their later conversations, something offhand, something she had perhaps not intended as a revelation. She had said that the reason she had gone to the rock formation twice, alone, before telling Collins about it, was not that she had forgotten to mention it. It was that it had not, at the time, seemed like something that needed to be mentioned. It had seemed, both times, like an ordinary thing to do, a simple, unremarkable decision. The most natural thing in the world. She had looked at Collins when she said this with the same steady, watchful intelligence she always had, and she said that what frightened her, when she thought about it afterward, was that she still could not find the exact moment when the decision had been made. She could not locate the point where her own judgment had ended and something else had begun. The two were joined so seamlessly that the seam was invisible. Collins thought about this often, about the afternoon on the widow Paulson's porch and the 40 minutes of conversation that had left him riding home through a silence in his own mind that had taken 2 deliberate acts of will to dispel. He thought about how long it had taken him to return to speak with Gray again, and how, when he had finally formed the intention to do so, Gray was already gone, as if something in the timing had been calculated with a precision that left no margin. He thought about the 2 women in Ohio. He thought about the other counties he did not know about. In the autumn of 1911, 3 years after Margaret Cross's door was found standing open in the morning cold, a woman named Helen Marsh came into Collins's office with the manner of someone who has been working up to something for a while. She was 34 years old, a farmer's wife from the southern end of the county, a part of Harlow County that had no connection to anything in Collins's investigation. She said that a man had been coming to her property since the summer. Tall, lean, light eyes, very quiet, very attentive. He had helped with repairs. He had had several long conversations with her in the evenings while her husband was in the fields. She said she was not sure why she was here. She said she felt fine. She said she simply wanted to mention it, because she had heard, from someone, that Collins was a person worth telling things to. She could not remember who had told her that. Collins looked at her across his desk for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines above the town, with that same low, continuous sound. He asked her to sit down. He asked her to tell him everything she could remember, starting from the beginning, starting from the first time the man had appeared at her gate and offered to help. She talked for an hour. Collins listened with his hands folded on the desk and his eyes level and his expression steady. And when she was finished, he told her that he thought she had done exactly the right thing in coming to him, and that he was going to need her to be very careful and very precise in the days ahead. He did not tell her what he was beginning to understand. He did not tell her that the name she had heard, that Collins was someone worth telling things to. That small push toward exactly the right door was itself the kind of detail that Gray's notebook had described in its methodical, precise, deeply satisfied hand. A preparation, a calculated first step, the earliest stage of a process that, once begun, felt to the person inside it exactly like their own free choice. He did not tell her, because he was not certain. And a man who dealt in facts could not act on what he was not certain of. But he sat with it through the long evening, alone in his office with the lamp burning, and felt the weight of the thing he could not prove, and the colder weight of the possibility that the feeling of certainty he was waiting for might be the one thing Gray had already decided he would never quite reach. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully. At what point in this account did you begin to feel that something was wrong? Not the obvious moments, not the open door or the empty cave, but the quieter ones. The moment Collins rode home from the porch feeling strangely still. The moment Amelia realized she could not find where her own decision had ended.
Because those are the moments that matter, and they are the moments most of us would miss entirely if no one pointed at them. Mr. Gray never raised his voice. He never made a threat. He left no marks and no evidence, and no victims who believed themselves to be victims. And that is precisely what makes this case one of the most disturbing in the history of that county, and, I would argue, one of the most relevant to our own time. The tools Gray used, patience, attention, the precise targeting of loneliness, have not disappeared. They have only become more efficient. If this story unsettled you, if it made you think, if it left you somewhere between doubt and certainty in a way you cannot quite resolve, then you understand exactly what it was designed to make you feel. Leave a comment below and tell me where you think the line is between genuine connection and manipulation. Tell me whether you believe Helen Marsh was already lost by the time she walked through Collins's door, or whether that visit was the thing that saved her. I want to know what you think, because this is the kind of question that does not have one answer, and the best thinking on it will come from all of you together. And if you want to follow more cases like this one, cases where the horror is not in what you can see, but in what you cannot, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories waiting, and some of them will sit with you longer than you expect. The hills of Pennsylvania are still there. The pines still stand in their rows above the old Ridgeline Road. Whatever Gray understood about those caves, about the particular quality of silence and enclosure that made his work more efficient, that understanding went with him when he disappeared and was never recovered. Some knowledge, perhaps, is better lost, but the question he leaves behind is not lost. It is very much alive, and you are already thinking about it.